Welcome everybody. This is Stacy Simmons. I'm putting together a much shorter version of my presentation. I have about an hour-long version that goes into a little more detail on my YouTube site. This one's going to be a little bit shorter to make it a little easier to digest. So I'm going to jump in. The research came out of my thesis research from Pacifica Graduate Institute about 3 years ago. This is an abridged version, but it basically comes down to a new archetype for women and female characters that is an answer to the hero's journey that most of you will be familiar with. So we get started with talking just very briefly about kind of the history of archetypes in terms of our modern telling. There are really kind of a few more maybe, but three people who are important to my research. The first one is Joseph Campbell, the next one is Carl Jung, and the third one is Louise von Franz. The first two you've probably heard of. Louise von Franz, unless you are a Jungian psychologist or a Jungian therapist, you may not have heard a lot of about her. She worked directly with Jung. She got a doctorate from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and she worked very closely with Jung. She was very integral in understanding fairy tales. So I love this quote: "Freeing yourself was one thing, and claiming ownership of that freed self was another." That is really the heart of what we're going to be talking about with this idea of the sovereign queen archetype and her constituent parts of the divided woman archetypes. And basically it comes down to, you can say that you're free all day long, but you really have to take ownership of that freed self in order to experience that kind of freedom, or have an experience of true sovereignty where you have ownership of yourself. Albert Pike said, "Liberty is the expression of sovereignty over oneself." And so that's kind of where we're going, and I want to just kind of prepare you that the goal here is to truly understand for characters and for real people that sovereignty is ultimately the goal. So what is an archetype? When you look at this image, I'm sure you get an idea right away. There's an archetype here. She's happy housewife, right? You don't have a question. You're not thinking about other things that she might be. And that's the power of archetypes. You get an image in your mind and it goes directly in. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to know what it is. You don't have to know the details to really kind of connect with whatever that character or that person is. So just some basic background, similar to Aristotle's forms. Archetypes are universal patterns, right? They don't require a lot of identification. They don't require a lot of rules. And because of that, we often get tied up with them, misclassifying them as something more mystical, when in reality they just carry all of this cultural baggage and cultural meaning with them. And so they transcend generations, they transcend culture. So in every culture, archetypes are shared across cultures. Like every culture has a mother archetype, every culture has a hero archetype, every culture has a father archetype. The other thing to remember about archetypes is that they are elevated beyond the human experience. So one of the dangers of archetypes is that for people who think about archetypes in the sense of identifying with an archetype, they often strip the human being who is identified with the archetype of their humanity. For instance, if you are a child and you see your parent as a godlike archetypal figure, you're not thinking of them as having human flaws. Similarly, women who get put into categories of trying to be perfect are stripped of their humanity frequently. I work with a lot of performers as a therapist, a lot of successful performers, and I also have noticed for them, especially ones that have some version of fame or notoriety, they often really suffer at the hands of fame, because when you're famous, you are kind of automatically elevated to the archetypal realms, And when that happens, you're stripped of your humanity. You don't have an automatic hook for those people who admire you. In reality, you are in the stratosphere, in the archetypal, and therefore you're elevated, which is often very hard on celebrities. So, and even people who don't have a great deal of fame, but who can even just have a little bit, very, very hard on them. So archetypes have this quality of being bigger than life. They're most dangerous when we can't name them, when they have this kind of miasmic presentation and we can't put our finger on them, but yet we recognize them nonetheless. This happened for me, though, when I was working on my thesis in 2015. When I started that research, I discovered an unnamed archetype, and then once I found her and named her, I started to find her everywhere. And that's who we're going to talk about today. So you're going to see here, if you like theater or film, you're going to recognize these characters as Glenda and Elphaba from Wicked. What's important about this is it's a great representation of the divided woman, which is the name of the archetype, one of the archetypes that I found. And I'm going to get into that in a minute, but it really is a great example of how women kind of walk through the world. We're given this set of rules that we are supposed to follow that don't really make a lot of sense. So we get mixed messages, like be available, but be unobtainable. Be pretty, but be serious. Be effortless, but work hard. Be agreeable, but be mysterious. And so on and so forth. You can see that this list seems kind of difficult to maintain. You can't do all of these things well. You can't make your own money and then depend on someone for money and have that really make sense to you. You can't need protection and still at the same time be strong and unprotected. It becomes really difficult in our culture, the way things work out. And so there seems to be another piece that's here, and if you dive into this, you realize that it's archetypal. What I found was, in my research, I wanted to look at the way that family films were representing women across the entire Disney filmography from 1937 with Snow White to the present, but I couldn't do that in an efficient manner, so I just looked at two films, Maleficent and Frozen, and I found this pattern of there being this ingenue type character and a magical character. And as I went back and looked through other films in the Disney filmography and other family films, I found that this was consistent, that this pattern existed everywhere. It was in Snow White, it was in Sleeping Beauty, it was in Little Mermaid, it was in Brave. It was kind of in Moana, but I'll get to Moana a little bit. She was everywhere. Even if the main character, like in Mulan, was a single character, she still was divided against herself in another way. So what this led me to was to try to understand these two halves of the divide. And what I came up with was I wanted to be careful not to just fall into traditional tropes of those two characters. So I named them differently. I gave them unique names so that we didn't just fall into old archetypes. The first one is the maiden type character, the maiden in search of relationship. That's the ingenue character. If you think of movies that you know, that would be like Snow White or Cinderella. And then the other one is magical, isolated, powerful, and endangered. And that would be like the Evil Queen, or in Frozen it would be Elsa. Maleficent it would be Maleficent. In Wicked it would be Elphaba. And what I found, and I just named these after their letters, Misor and Mipe, is that if you go to almost any telling of these stories that feature women characters, you're going to find this divide. There's a Misor and a Mipe character, or there's a Misor and a Mipe half of the character. And I found it everywhere. Everywhere I looked, there she was. Whether I was looking in history, so that's Demeter and Persephone in the top left. There's Eve and Lilith in the ancient Hebrew Bible. There's, of course, Glenda and Elphaba. There's even Princess Celestia and Sparkle Pony and My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, Inanna and Ereshkigal, Gal, and even, modern television or contemporary television of characters in Bewitched like Samantha and Serena. So this divide, she shows up everywhere, this twinned character. There's always a divided woman at the heart of every story. And when I was working on my research, I predicted, just because what happened with looking at the Disney filmography is those two characters got closer and closer to each other over the course of the 90 years from when Snow White was made to the creation of Frozen, which is when I was writing my thesis. Moana had not come out yet. And my hope was that the next Disney princess would actually be a sovereign queen, meaning she would not need a romantic interest. She would not need to be fighting for her role in her society. She would just need to be kind of handling her own journey. She would have her own autonomy and sovereignty, and she'd be on her own quest. That's exactly what happened in Moana. And they even paid homage to the divided woman story with the division between Te Kā and Te Fiti in the story itself. And again, this is not conscious. Like, this stuff doesn't happen consciously. This is all in the collective unconscious. So it's pretty interesting that it's happening right in front of our eyes. And then as I went looking, I found, of course, the queens everywhere. This is, Wrinkle in Time and Legally Blonde, Waitress, The Color Purple, Beasts of the Southern Wild. The queen and her constituent parts of the Misor and the Mipe, they are everywhere. Interesting, a little fact of looking at these other plays and films, the easiest path for sovereignty is for a Misor to become sovereign, not for Mipe. And the reason is because the Mipe has a much farther journey to get back into the fold of society, but we'll get to that in a second. But you could see that, every single one of these plays has this story. If you've seen any of these movies or plays, you know that there's a story at the center of it of a woman who is divided against herself, or a girl who is divided against herself, and she has to go on a journey to reclaim that other side of herself. So, the sovereign queen, she's a balance between the Mipe and the Misor. She may lean more towards one or the other, but she's independent. She has her sovereignty, and she knows that her power comes from uniting those two divided sides, not from pushing one of them away. She doesn't participate in the struggle between the two sides. That puts her in a dyadic position. The struggle does not serve her. And she does not allow herself to be disrespected. She's also not haughty or brash. So, importantly, this idea of impera, divide and impera, that is divide and conquer. But impera has this other connotation of commanding and ruling over, that conquering seems to gloss over. So, divide and command and rule over really speaks to the heart of this idea of the divided woman. So, what does this mean for storytelling? So I've created something I call the Path of the Queen, that has looked at movies and films and books and plays, and really tries to get to the heart of how this works for telling a story about a woman's journey. And I'm going to go through the quadrants, and I'm trying to go pretty fast, but you can always reach out to me and ask me questions if you want. And I'll try to get to the heart of it with you if need be. So the circle itself is built into 4 quadrants, and you'll see that here it goes like the face of a clock. So at 12 o'clock is where we start, and then we go clockwise around. So we start off in the chimeric quadrant, that's quadrant 1, go down to quadrant 2 where it says time period, the rendering. Then quadrant 3 is the depths. Quadrant 4 is resplendent, so it moves like a clock. So 12 o'clock, and then on the way around. And everything above the horizon is the world of visible power and form. So that's the world that you can see. And everything below the horizon, below the x-axis, is the world of invisible forces and mystery. So you'll see that happening as we kind of go through the circle. Okay, so quadrant one. We begin with Once Upon a Time. And important to the story is the idea, of course, of Once Upon a Time is that the world appears balanced, but something disrupts that balance. Something disrupts the world of good and evil. The important thing to remember about this quadrant is it's called chimeric because the character or characters are undifferentiated. They don't have real awareness. So the next section is called the cursing. So there's a curse or a separation event. So if you are familiar with stories or films, Aurora is cursed by Maleficent here, or Celie in The Color Purple is sent to live with Mr. That's where this would happen. The next one is pretty important. This is called marked. So the character is revealed, hurt, or marked, or bears a scar. And this sets her up to be placed in a category, which is kind of the next section. But what's interesting is it correlates in some stories to the beginning of menstruation for some storytellers, but I think that this is still a little early for that. I don't think it's quite accurate, because what I'm finding as a therapist and psychologically going through this with real women is that the marking actually starts earlier than that, starts around the age of 8 or 9 years old. So after the character gets her mark, whether it's being slapped or getting her hair change color or getting a dress or somehow knowing that she's going to have to choose, or being hinted at that she's going to have a choice to make, she's then blind. She's then blinded by the ambiguity of everything around her. She's blinded by the undifferentiated world of visible power and form. She's unaware that anything means anything, and she tries to live kind of straddling these two worlds. It's really kind of living, pretending like everything's going to be okay, and pretending that there's not something right in front of you, some obvious thing to show that you've been marked. And then what happens next in this very first quadrant is what I call the dissolution, where we start to see that dotted line starts to be the thing that it's getting ready to happen. There's getting ready to be a divide. The character is getting ready to be one or the other, the Misor or the Mipe. She's going to be put into a category. So if she becomes a Misor, she's going to have security in relationships but no power. If she becomes a Mipe, she's going to have knowledge and power but no security and very few relationships, and she's going to be unprotected. And so the Misor is on the inside because she's more protected, and the Mipe is on the outside of the circle because she's less protected. So that brings us into quadrant 2, and the kind of theme for this quadrant is the broken quadrant, because in this quadrant the character is completely rendered into 2. So at the very beginning of this part of the quadrant, she commits to her role. Now that's not to say that she commits to her Mipe or Misor status. It means she commits to the role that she's given. So with that in mind, Dolores in Sister Act, for example, she kind of decides that she has no choice but to live as a nun. Snow White agrees to cook and clean for the 7 dwarves, right? For the Mipe, it's Elsa agreeing to be a queen. She's going to put on her gloves and try to take on all the roles of the queen. Maleficent retreats to the moors, trying to force herself to live as a fairy creature with no wings. And Elphaba picks up the hat and wears the hat that Glinda gives her as a gift. But this is really the beginning of the character being cleaved. This is the beginning of the rendering really taking hold. And then this encounter part is important because it doesn't have to happen here, but it can happen here. The encounter, though, often happens in the second quadrant. Encounter happens with a magical creature or magical counterpart. Sometimes the magical counterpart is the other sister. So in The Color Purple, the magical counterpart is Shug from, who is Mr.'s love interest, his true love. And Celie just had no idea what that would be like. And so, she has no idea that that's her counterpart. That's her other half. Now, she also has another half in her real sister, Nettie, but, the magical other half is as well Shug in The Color Purple. So the encounter, this is the first place that it's possible, is after that first cleaving. So that's why I put it here, but it can be anywhere. And then the sisters meet as themselves. Again, this doesn't have to happen in this order. This circle is much more of a spiral. So at any point in any of the 4 quadrants, these things can happen, but the quadrants tend to stick together. For this moment, the mirror moment, the sisters see each other. They meet as themselves. They meet as their one counterpart to the other. They don't know, though, yet that they need one another. That happens later in the 3rd quadrant. So what you have then, what happens after that mirror moment, is that each of the sisters, or each of the halves, commits to her mark. So this is where she commits to being a Misor or a Mipe. This is where Elle decides she's going to leave Harvard, for example. She's like, I'm a Misor. I can't be a Mipe. I'm going to leave Harvard. They win. I'm done. For the Mipe characters, it's when Elphaba leaves Oz, defying gravity. This is where things get real, and the 2 characters realize that they have been assigned this role, and they have to live in it. And then what's next is the part that I call the hunt, which takes us into the 3rd quadrant. And the hunt is not always being pursued, but it does isolate the characters one way or another, where they feel either that they're being chased or they're being threatened in some way, one or the other, not necessarily both of them. Often the Mipe is driven into isolation, or if it's a Misor on a Mipe journey, like in Legally Blonde, she's driven into isolation in a different way. Or Mipe is driven away, even further away from her goal of wanting to be near civilization. So it gets very complicated. But the hunt just simply means that there's a drive for that character to find herself in a new way. So then quadrant 3, this is really the dangerous quadrant. This is one that always upsets me when I talk about it, because most stories for women end here. Quadrant 3 is where happily ever after happens. Quadrant 3 is where most stories end for female characters or for women characters. When we move from the hunt into the 3rd quadrant, we're in the depth period. And remember, we're in that level of the unconscious. We're in the world of invisible forces and mystery down here. So we've gone from the hunt to breaking the mirror. So at this point, the sisters break with one another. They look at each other and they say no, which leads to an abjection. Now, abjection means, if you've ever heard the term, somebody turned in abject horror, it means that you revile the thing that you're looking at. You turn away, you look away, you don't accept it. And so abjection means to take that other side and to refuse it. You say, if I'm a Misor, I'm going to turn the Mipe away. I'm going to take every part of me that is Mipe and I'm going to exorcise it. I'm not going to allow it. And vice versa with the Mipe and the Misor. If I'm a Mipe, I'm going to not allow any Misor part of me to exist. So there's some event. That's the breaking of the mirror. And then there's the abjection, right? And this is the abjection is the most dangerous part of the story, because it's in the abjection where that other part of the sister can be lost forever. Something threatens to make this break between them permanent. So the Mipe can become what Jungians call animus possessed, where she gets consumed with her ambition, or she gets consumed with her privilege, or she gets consumed with what she wants in her life. And the Misor often will become married, right? She'll marry or she'll die in childbirth here. And if she gets married and the story ends with happily ever after, then we never know what happens to her. We never know the end of her life. We never know what happens to her after that moment of getting married and partnering in a new way, where a relationship with a partner comes in between her becoming whole with the other half of herself, right? And a good example of this is on the diagram. It says the Misor can become married, and then it says in parentheses to death. That's in relationship to Persephone. So Persephone is an example of this. She goes into the underworld and she's married literally to the god of death. And that's all about giving up your sovereignty to this idea of childbearing and culture and everything being over for you once you make that choice. Now, that's not saying that in real life that that's what happens. It's saying that if you give over that idealization of your life to only that moment, to only that expression of what your life could or should be, then the story ends there, and it's tragic. So that takes us then to the opportunity for the next piece, which is choice. And in the hero's journey, this would be the resurrection. But this is a place where, in rethinking that abjection, each character has to rethink that choice. And if they rethink it with action, the Mipe then realizes she has to give up her power if she's going to be in relationship. She realizes that she's going to become wicked or irredeemable if she doesn't do something. And the Misor has to show agency and stand up for her sister. So in Frozen is a great example. Anna has to save her sister. She has to, instead of running to her potential lover, she runs to save her sister. If this is a story that has a tragic ending and the Misor dies in childbirth, the baby that she has will often become a Mipe baby. So the Mipe will grow up and be a witch character or a magical creature character, or someone has the struggle of being shunned by society. So once this happens, where there's choice and the characters make their choices and decide that they're going to go against the objection, they're going to reverse the objection, then they exchange powers, right? Or they make an attempt to exchange powers. And the thing that happens as a result is this idea of transcendent embodiment. Now, this becomes a little esoteric because what it means is that the embodiment itself, the idea that I am not separated from my body, that is my body that makes me powerful, is the thing that takes them into the next quadrant of sovereignty. So if you remember from quadrant 1, we talked about the mark. I forgot to mention that the mark essentially separates the character from her body, where she starts to realize that she doesn't get to be human. She doesn't get to be limited to her physical being. She's got to have that archetypal, she's got to reach into the archetypal realm and live part of her life there. And that's really, really dangerous. And so by coming back here into the third quadrant and making a choice and exchanging the powers with her sister or with her other side, she has the potential for embodied transcendence. So the Mipe may take on society for the Misor. Misor makes her personal sacrifice for the Mipe, but then they may go to war together, or they may, overcome the powers that be together. Like in Maleficent, Maleficent regains her wings and goes to war, and Aurora joins in the battle and tries to help and is the one who restores the wings and frees the wings from Maleficent. I just wanted to add one more thing about some of the things that you see in the diagram. So that green line and the dotted line. So that solid green line that you see on the inside, that is again a continuation of the separation of the Mipe from the Misor. And then the dotted line that you see over there is the beginning of the embodied transcendence that's going to carry through to the next quadrant. And I just want to kind of highlight that because the two halves are still separate in this part of the diagram in the third quadrant, but they do come together in the next one. So now we're finally in the fourth quadrant, and this is where everything comes together, and we really start to understand what sovereignty means. And all the pieces come together. The reason that the lines here are dotted is because all of these attributes really kind of blend into one another. They're not hard lines of separation, right? So once the power of the body is restored, once that transcendent quality of the body is restored to each of the parts of the character, or to each character, then that character then has sovereignty over her full self. And this is important because the body itself is a symbol of the marking that goes back to the first quadrant story, where she gets slapped with the mark. So the mark separates her. It's the first indicator that she's going to be separated from her body. And that's so important because it means that she's joining the archetypal realms in a divided way. And by going to the fourth quadrant, she's going to be reunited with her body. Though it's still somewhat archetypal, it's transcendent of the limits of the archetypal realm. So you can kind of see there's some examples here. Dolores can sing, not as a nun, but she's uncovered. Celie confronts Mr. and curses him, and her life is healed. Then once the corporeal, the body side of this is restored, then the sisters themselves or the unified character can claim her territory or her crown. So in Frozen, the sisters combine forces and they get their realm back. One or both may claim their birthright. With Celie in color purple, the character gets her own house. There's, once we're in Sister Act, there's the character Dolores is now singing in the church in front of the Pope. She's got her own thing. Everybody's got their own territory once the sovereignty is achieved. And the sisters realize, or the singular character realizes that she has to have all of herself. Or if they're sister characters, they realize they have to have the other one in balance. So what you may see, like in Maleficent, is an actual coronation ceremony where you have the ceremony with Maleficent putting the crown on Aurora's head and declaring her queen of the realm. That's gonna, that is a symbol of, no, we need each other. We have, and we are uniting our forces in a way that is official, meaningful, and is in the world of visible power and form, not just an acknowledgement between the two of us. And then finally, that crowned idea, the idea that sovereignty is not only an internal symbol, something that we say or that we take on for ourselves, but that it is an outward symbol that's saying, no, I'm queen of my own life. You don't get to do this for me. Is something that is a mark of sovereignty beyond, that is reclaimed from that first mark, right? And by doing that, we claim our own domain, we take possession of our own bodies, minds, souls, fate, destiny, gifts, and that's ultimately the message of claiming your crown and having a sovereign queen character means that she does not require a partner necessarily. She can choose to have a partner, but she does not require a partner. She is strong, life and love affirming, and she is differentiated. She's not undifferentiated. She's differentiated, and she has gone through this process of differentiating herself and reunifying the parts that need reunification. So that's pretty much the whole kit and caboodle of the journey itself. There's a lot more to this. There's a lot more ways of telling the story, but I was trying to cut it down. I wound up cutting it down not as much as I was hoping. But if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. These are my different ways of getting in touch with me. Stacy@delightful.company or stacysimmons@mac.com. The Fempire is a short-term one, so don't try that one. Deep Archetype is my blog, and that is my phone number. I am a psychotherapist in private practice in Burbank, California, so if you can't get hold of me, I may just be in session. Leave me a message, and I will look forward to talking to you if you have any questions. Thanks.